So hi everyone, I'm here with Ewan Willars today from Amplify Global, and they're in the intelligibility space for customer communication. So Ewan, thanks very much for joining me.
Not at all, Chris. Happy to be here.
So maybe just explain a little bit for listeners, just really around the difference between readability and intelligibility, because that's how we started to come across it, at least when I first met you guys.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a common misconception, to be honest, to conflate the two things. So intelligibility ultimately means that something can be read, that it can be understood, and then actually that information then can be used by the consumer. This is a legal interpretation of what intelligibility means in the law. And that's where the requirement for intelligibility comes from. It comes from the Consumer Rights Act. It's been around since the 1970s. But until fairly recently, the main focus in the marketplace has been about readability, which has actually been as a concept. It doesn't really exist in legal terms, but it's been around for a long time because that's where the science has been focused. And so you have these frameworks like Flesch-Kincaid and others that are claiming to provide a proxy for whether something will be understood, but actually there's a very poor link between simple readability and whether something is then understood. You can have lots of short sentences with lots of short words in it, and it can still be complex. The conceptual side of things, the information, whether those words are known and are commonly used, has a big impact on whether someone will actually understand that. So the fact that everybody in the marketplace, and there's lots of tools out there, we all know the names of them, I won't mention them, they've been focused on these readability metrics. But actually now, because of the consumer duty, there's a bigger focus on intelligibility, and people are now beginning to realize that what they've been looking at for a long time hasn't actually been a good measure of intelligibility. So they're looking around to work out how they can assess intelligibility in this new post-consumer duty world. And so we've focused on actually assessing intelligibility, not readability.
Yeah, so it's moving from, we've all seen it in things like contracts or in websites where there's like the number of words on the page goes down to less, and it's almost like it's like simple sort of business language. But you're saying that doesn't necessarily equate to intelligibility, which is, do you actually understand what's written on the paper? You might have less words on it, but it doesn't mean to say that you actually understand the sense of what's being said, which I suppose to your point around good customer outcomes, it's really around, do you understand it because you've got to take action on something?
Exactly that, yeah. Can you take an informed decision? You've read something, did you understand it? And then can you actually apply it to your own situation? So can you understand the rights that you have, the obligations that you have, the risks that might be involved in a particular product, and be able to compare them effectively? You can have lots of documents that we see out there now have gone through a process where sentences have been shortened and some of the longer words have been replaced. But actually at the heart of things, if you're talking about APR, for example, in a credit card contract, that's an incredibly complex concept for most people to fully understand unless you provide a really simple explanation. And so just because something is readable absolutely doesn't mean to say that it's intelligible and understandable and usable.
Yeah. How do you balance it? And I'm just thinking about contracts here, and you mentioned APR as an example, explaining a concept so it's straightforward and simple enough to be understood versus really understanding the complexity of it to a certain extent. So APR, it's down to annual percentage rate, it's down to 3 words already, and you actually might need more words to actually make people understand it. And there's different levels of understanding as well. So less is not necessarily more in all cases, I would have thought.
No. That's one of the challenges, and that things like terms and conditions and agreements are long enough already. And so to add more words, more detail does create an extra layer of problems for the reader. But the key is to explain these things in real world terms, really simple language, alongside whatever the prescribed or industry terminology that you have to put in there for legal reasons is, to explain it in place. So not to have a glossary off to one side that the consumer has to look at. Nobody does that. Nobody's going to sit there with 2 documents working out what a particular word means. So you have to provide, in the FCA's terms, adequate explanation. But in real layman's terms, that means you have to provide a simple an explanation and bring it to life with illustrations or whatever it might be that explain it to the reader in a way that they can apply to their context, their real life.
So it's almost like the translation is almost like the explainer notes that sit on in almost like in the margin on the legal notes on the left to a certain extent.
Absolutely, and actually that's an interesting point, the idea of sort of explanation being side by side, in that we still rely on a legal system that expects things to be in written form, in a paper-based, now PDF, but still it's a sort of an A4 flat text approach, whereas actually now we've got digital ways of explaining things and presenting things, that you can have hover-overs and you can have explainers embedded in the text and so on, that don't disrupt the reader, but provide that simple explanation in a layered approach on top of it. And that's some of the work we're looking at with the FCA as well. We really want to explore how layering can help consumers understand complex information more easily.
Okay. A recent example. So I went to a lecture, as a science lecture, and the discussion there, we're talking about some complex ideas. And obviously you can talk about the maths of it. For example, Stephen Hawking used to talk about that, and he had one equation in his book. And I suppose you can understand things down to almost like that level, and it becomes super, super complex versus having things almost like at a brushed over level. And there was definitely a bit of frustration around, if you don't understand the detail and you want to understand the detail, the high level explanation is not going to be enough. However, the high level explanation might be enough, but not in all cases. And I suppose, how do we meet that balance so people aren't exposed, particularly when you get to like legal terms and conditions, or in the collections world, you're looking at contracts or payment arrangements, whatever, debt advice recommendations, those kind of things, is you don't want to leave anything off the table, and yet you don't want to overburden people by having too much.
I guess the truth is that you have to test these things out with consumers and to see what approach works best. Some of the work that we've been doing hasn't just been around simplifying the language either. That's a big part of the issue. There's lots of factors that go towards creating things that are intelligible. Some of it is how you structure it, having clear headings and titles that actually mean something to the reader, not just to the person who's writing them, as a way of organizing the text. In addition, you can begin to look at how the ordering of a document might help. So we've been looking at default notices. So that's the legal paper that you receive when you've missed a couple of payments on your credit card, for example, telling you that actually you're at legal risk now. You might end up in court, you need to make action. The way that it's required by the FCA at the moment is all about the warning. It's the legal risk that you're facing, and then a little bit at the bottom about what you can do about it. And so we've been looking to simplify it, but at the same time, we've actually looked at reordering it. So putting the action that you can take up front, and then explaining what the legal situation is, and ultimately what your consequences are and the risks affect, but really leading with the action. Call the creditor, call the organization that you owe the money to. They're there to help. They can put you back on plan. They're going to be sympathetic to your cause. And we see the level of trust increasing quite substantially, and also the likelihood that someone's actually going to pick up the phone and take action increasing quite substantially. So simplifying it on its own is a big step forward, simplifying the language, that is, but also looking at the structure, the ordering. Putting in big, bold red letters doesn't help. It scares people. It doesn't actually encourage people to read this and engage with the information.
Yeah, there's an interesting discussion at some of the vulnerability conferences we've been to recently, which is all around, like, it's the hesitation or the procrastination that happens if you have too much warnings, and the anxiety that's associated with that versus taking it down a notch and actually getting more action and helping more people as a result. So it's
absolutely, yeah. You want to avoid the whole ostrich thing, the head in the sand and the pile of red letters unopened by the doorstep. But you want people to understand that there's action they can take, make it as simple and as guided as possible.
Yeah. So how do we go about measuring intelligibility in particular, but also outcomes as well? So with Consumer Duty coming along, a good outcome was one of the things that we're looking to try and get evidence around. But how do you best do that? So certainly on outcomes, that can be a tricky thing to look at. Was it the right outcome for a particular customer? But how do you actually measure and think about actually measuring, was it actually understood, which sort of links to outcomes as well?
We've got a fair bit of experience of this now with our work in the sandbox and working with Nottingham University and the Gilmore Centre as well up in Warwick Business School. Ultimately, our framework, our assessment tool, looks at a number of different factors. So it looks at the structure of the document, it looks at the readability, because that is part of it, but it also looks at the conceptual complexity too. So how hard are these words? What layers of meaning do you have? But also, are there lots of sentences with semicolons and subclauses and so on, which can increase the complexity for the reader quite substantially. So there's lots of factors to consider. A lot of those you can measure quite objectively. So you can create a benchmark for more intelligible text, and that's what we help our clients to do. But when you want to look at ultimately the outcome, some of that we can do in the lab. So we can put this in front of consumers, but not necessarily in a real world experience. And we actually use eye tracking to look at whether they're understanding what they're reading. We use that alongside comprehension quizzes and other things, because the eyes don't lie. When you're reading a bit of text, the eyes flicker around the words that actually they're not understanding very clearly or they're unsure about, and they'll flick backwards and forwards within the text to try and glue the bits of information together in a way that you're not always actually very conscious of as the reader. So there's lots of almost biometric ways that you can begin to assess what's being understood and what's not. But ultimately, the outcome is that consumer is then empowered to make an appropriate choice. And so some of the metrics of misunderstanding or poor outcomes, you can see things like the number of calls into your call center around particular topics. You can look at the later down, sort of downstream, look at the number of complaints that you're getting about particular products or particular issues. We know that FOS gets a lot of complaints around people not knowing that their overdrafts cost them money. So maybe we need to explain that better. But the problem with that is that's looking at the problem once it's already happened. What we're quite keen to do is to now look at the point of delivery. So there's ways of assessing how people, through a guided digital journey, how people are engaging with that information on the screen. Rather than just giving them a PDF and either you read it or you don't, if you take them through a guided journey, you can begin to look at how long they spend on particular elements, but also have very short little areas of comprehension within. Do you feel confident in what you've just read, for example? You begin to almost triage out that understanding at the point of delivery. We think that's a much more effective way, but there's a lot of firms struggling with this at the moment. They're thinking, how do I measure it? And I'm not sure anyone's got the full answer at the moment.
Yeah, and I suppose you've got that lagged indicator, which is a common problem often in collections, at least the collections process, which is it's so lagged, it's very hard to go back to what the actual, to measure things in real time is very difficult, isn't it? But I suppose that lagged indicator can then be indicative around what are the things you need to do today. So, for example, intelligibility or eye tracking or those kind of things. Is there a correlation between that and better outcomes? What are some of the themes you're thinking? So you mentioned headlines, shorter sentences, those kind of things. But what are the principles around trying to drive up understanding?
I think structuring information in a straightforward and navigable way, I think is a fundamental part of this. Too often we still see in agreement information, for example, about interest rates and a credit card agreement. There'll be some information towards the beginning of the document and there'll be a whole load of other information further down. And that's requiring the consumer to navigate their way through an often 20-page document. It's just really providing good navigation, providing good, simple, logical flow of information is important. Of course, the readability elements are important too, structuring it in a way that doesn't have enormous, great long lists of bullet points and so on that all have to be in your head to be able to understand it fully. That's not good practice. So short, punchy bits of information, avoiding passive voice and all of that stuff. But as well, looking at the conceptual sides, we look at how complex words are to understand, and that comes from education and also we look at linguistic models and so on. And so you've got examples like words. Let's pick. So secret. Most people understand what a secret is. It has got certain layers of information. You then think about what private means, and actually private is almost a root of secret with some extra layers of meaning, nuance layered on top of that. And then you get to confidential. It's a longer word, more syllables, which is inherently less readable, but also it's got additional layers of nuance. Actually, that's a much harder word for a consumer to understand. It's much less commonly used, and it's got these additional layers. And that's part of what we're looking at. That's the conceptual complexity. Is someone who's new to country, potentially has English as a second language, are they going to understand that much more complex conceptual word? And so we try and strip that away a little bit and then help our clients to understand where that complexity lies, so you can identify it and then explain around it or miss out that particularly complex sentence in another way.
Yeah, I certainly remember credit card contracts, I think it was, and I think the directive was to get it on one page, and it came out as a tiny little folded sheet, a bit like the medical things you got, and it folded out to a massive sheet like this, and it was all like in the smallest text you could possibly see, because everything had to be on there, but it wasn't one page, it was just on a massive page. It's like, how do you strip that back to a certain extent?
Well, I mean, we're actually looking at credit card agreements at the moment, and the difference between approaches from different providers varies enormously. For some clauses, for example, interest rate, there's one example from one bank. I won't name them. They've got a very elegant paragraph, and it's literally 3 or 4 lines explaining what your interest rate is and what that means in real terms for you. Other banks might have 2 pages of information because they've designed their product to be quite complex with lots of different promotional rates and lots of nuance in their interest rate. And so the product is actually driving some of the complexity we see. And then on top of that, they've used really quite industry terminology, not very friendly common words and so on. And so what you end up with is a mixture of product complexity and linguistic complexity, just creating this awful document, much too long, much too detailed. No one's ever going to engage with that. And even if they do, they won't understand it. So there's ways of bringing that to light that we're quite keen to do and showcase this.
Yeah, that's quite an interesting angle just in terms of product design. And often people will find, so I suppose, nuances in particular product design that might be beneficial for the customer also, or for the business. And there's like finding those sort of like almost like these complex kind of curves in the contract, what actually a much simpler product would actually be a lot easier to explain. Interest
Oh,
rates is a good example in terms of, payment hierarchies and those, which elements gets paid first and those kind of things.
100%. At least the FCA have noticed this. So part of the consumer duty is about simplifying your product. If your
Yeah,
product can't be explained in easy terms, it's the
yeah,
wrong kind of product
yeah,
design. You need to
yeah.
rethink that a little bit, which I think is really key. That drives complexity, but actually you can still describe these things in a better way than we're seeing. Even post consumer duty, we're seeing too much firms trying to manage their own risks, not the risks to
Mm,
the consumer, but their own risks by taking this legalistic style and introducing these kind of really complex clauses that are there to protect
mm,
them.
mm.
Long lists of things that you can and can't do and so on that don't really mean much to the consumer. They're there because the lawyers decided they're really important.
Yeah. How much of this complexity do you think also drives extra cost? And so actually by focusing on simplifying your product, simplifying the language, via simplifying the language, you can actually take cost out.
I certainly think that there are ways of reducing costs through simplicity and through
Mm,
intelligibility. Firstly, products that are right for people. And part of intelligibility is about explaining what products are right for an individual and maybe what aren't.
mm,
What product suitability is a big thing. You can reduce the cost later on of default because they've taken out the wrong product. They don't have
mm,
enough money. Ultimately, it's unaffordable. You'll get complaints about mis-selling as well. And that's been a huge cost, obviously, with
mm,
PPI and everything else over the years. So there are inherent downstream costs. Interestingly, the cost to the consumer are not considered quite in the same way. So within
mm,
credit card agreements, one of the more complex clauses that we see, and actually one that tends to be buried still now, right down at the bottom
mm,
of the document, is charges. So what
mm,
charges and defaults, charges and so on the consumer might face. So I think there's lots of different aspects to it. I don't think firms are deliberately trying to save any of their own cost by creating this complexity. I think it's a legal risk reduction exercise, if I'm
yeah,
honest. And I think it's
yeah,
just the inertia of this is the way it's always been done. So let's
yeah.
carry on with that.
I was thinking as much around things like complaints. I was looking through FOS complaints the other day, and you can see just like how the costs would just get added up. By the time it's gone backwards and forwards, and they've asked for extra, and the cost even to the consumers when they're asking for support details. But you can see how that's getting added up, both for the ombudsman service, but also for the companies as well, because they have to have teams dealing with this. So if you have less of those, then it can take cost out.
Absolutely. Call center costs are quite high. Certainly the cost of complaints are high
Mm,
and are rising as well. And I think we're seeing, even though we've had this process of unbundling products because the added complexity that we were seeing with creating complaints, we're still seeing a lot of complexity there.
mm.
And we're still seeing complaints coming forward because consumers don't know what they're getting into. They're making bad choices based on misinformation.
Yeah. So you talked earlier a little bit about layering and layering of information in terms of like how do you almost drill down into the detail? How do you think that's going to evolve going forward? Is that what you see as almost like you'll have this top level and then you'll be able to drill down into more detail to find some of the additional complexities if you need to understand it?
Yeah, there's so many different factors to this. Part of what you're talking about is around prominence and also the timing of information. There may be
Mm,
information that's more important at the point of sale than
mm,
maybe later on when you might need it because you've got a problem paying or you want to
mm,
make a complaint and so on. So making sure that the right information is made prominent to the consumer is a big issue. And I think the FCA still need to think about that and how that's managed. I do think that at the moment we haven't really bottomed out what the benefit of a more digital journey could be. And that's really where our focus is, because I think you can bring so many more aspects forward and people understand things in different ways. Ultimately, you can't treat a consumer as being an average consumer, which is what we've done for the last 50
mm,
years. The idea of this in law, the consumer being circumspect and observant and
mm,
so on, it's just not real. Let's
mm.
face it. We're not observant, circumspect
Yeah,
consumers. We want it now and we don't want to read all the gump that comes with it.
yeah.
I think providing a more engaging way of getting this information across, which could be potentially spliced with video content or spoken word, because some people like infographics more. They like to see information explained in bite-sized chunks, which may not be
Mm,
possible in a contract, but you can begin to bring that into an onboarding journey in a way that you can't do with a flat presentation of PDF or written
mm,
word and so on. But at the moment, the law doesn't really allow that. So the FCA is in this weird position where they're talking about layering as a positive thing, but actually the rules that they oversee make that very difficult to deliver. So I think
yeah.
we're going to see a focus on enabling this richer, digital guided way of presenting information rather than here's 20 pages, read it or not.
Yeah, I think it's quite an interesting challenge to I suppose the accepted norms in the legal system, isn't it? Because you want to be able to say, I presented everything to you, therefore you've read it, or therefore you've accepted it. And if you move away from that, saying I'm going to produce you a reduced set of that or a guided set of that, you can say, actually, I didn't get to read this piece.
Yeah, if you had a literally one pager, but not in your
Mm.
folded sort of a napkin
Double-sided
approach,
as well.
yeah, exactly. If you had a, just gets worse. But you can now summarize it, and actually we're developing AI that can do this in a pretty straightforward way. You can summarize complex information to really distill it down to the key stuff. Firstly, that's one thing that you can do that helps the consumer, and that's a very basic form of layering. So you can have this sort of highlights sort of section on top of what is then the detailed legal contract. You can, as I say, digital versions, there's all sorts of things you can do around comprehension, ensuring that people are confident in what they're reading as well by going down this route. And there's lots of research going on. We're doing lots of research now to look at how that's best done and how much the law needs to change to enable that to be done. But as a lawyer, that's a million miles away from writing your document on a word processor, printing it out, tying it up with pink ribbon and whatever else needs to be done, and getting someone to sign on the bottom line. And that's part of what we see as the problem. The problem is not necessarily just around complex products or people misunderstanding what readability versus intelligibility is. Part of the problem is inertia, and inertia partly in financial services, but particularly in the legal profession. They are I'm obviously generalizing here massively, but they are relatively conservative. They struggle to bring on innovation. I think they're wary of change. And I think this is holding back their desire to move forward, to look at how, for example, AI, tools like Amplify can help them. There's always this belief that lawyers can write what they need to write. They have the legal brain and the legal training behind it. Why would you question that? And actually, we're working now with the Solicitors Regulation Authority to look at what this kind of technology could mean for the legal profession. But that issue of inertia, that issue of this isn't how it's done here, that percolates through every industry, because there's lawyers working within these organizations in a compliance role, signing off these documents with their legal brains. And I think that's a layer of challenge that we need to break through a little bit. And we're trying to do that. It's a big difficulty.
There's been a lot of talk around AI. I'm talking about large language models here. I suppose there's been a lot in like predictive transformers, the new statistical methods that come out, blending that with education, actually, which is if you sit there and if you have personalized education, you actually learn a lot more. How much do you think that can help with contract? You mentioned AI already, in terms of almost like providing that drill down set to say, well, look, here are asking the questions of almost like the contract to say, here are the top 5 things that are the most important. And then you can almost ask question and answers going forward.
I think AI can help in lots of different ways. Firstly, obviously, it's embedded in the way that we do things, but we can begin to potentially look at the type of reader that's likely to be engaged with this information and tailor it accordingly. And that's really a big step forward, and people seem to be missing this in the consumer duty. We're still applying a one-size-fits-all approach to these communications. The idea of the average consumer and so on. Actually, you can begin to think about different types of consumers. Are they vulnerable consumers? Are they English as a second language consumers? Are they older or younger, and so on? So you can write with that type of consumer in mind, and actually AI can help you to do that and simplify it in a way that makes sense to that consumer, and not even necessarily simplify it as far as you might like. If it's a lawyer that's receiving this, maybe you want that additional nuance in it, but you still want it to be as simple and yet enforceable as possible. I think ultimately where we're headed with this is the very beginning of a journey. I think we're going to find that firms start to embrace this in a different way. At the moment, they've just tweaked what they currently do to be in line with the regulations. So they're simplifying things and they're doing a bit of testing and so on. That's great for us. Fantastic. We're very much part of that. I think as we go forward, they'll want to think, actually, what's the next step? How do I make sure that individual has understood it at the point of delivery? That's one thing. How do I triage out those with issues or lack of confidence? And how do I then intersect that to prevent an expensive complaint later on, or a default, or whatever else? So I think that's one area. I think secondly, as I say, designing communications with the recipient in mind. Who's likely to be receiving this? Which cohorts are going to be reading this stuff? And how do I make it more meaningful for them, rather than this blank beige sort of approach where hopefully one size fits all, and if it doesn't, well, it's buyers beware.
It feels like when we talk a lot about personalized communications, and that really usually means we put the name in or those kind of things. But actually, what you're talking about is really personalized communications, just like you would do with a friend or a family member or a colleague, where you're having one-on-one conversations where it's personalized around what you know their needs are. So, and you're
Yeah.
pitching it at the right level and you're doing those kind of things. I mean, it sounds like we're on that path bit by bit, and you guys are making great strides really at the front end of that.
Yeah, it's more about the reader or the types of readers. I think you can quite effectively think about that in a way that you
Mm,
can't at the moment. I don't think we're in any way close to personalizing it on a one-to-one basis, although
yeah.
perhaps that's the future. But I think you can begin to put people in cohorts. And I think they
Mm,
do have common characteristics and common ways of engaging with information, not just what they know
mm,
and what they can read and understand, but actually how do they engage with that information best? And I think you can
mm,
better meet their needs by understanding more about the consumer.
mm,
And people like banks know a lot about you. Part of the
mm,
application processes is they find out your job and they find out how wealthy you are and where you live and what your background is and how much
mm,
education you've had and where you've come from
mm.
and so on and so forth. So actually using that demographic information can provide you with ways to personalize. And I
Yeah.
don't think, yeah, as I say, one-to-one's probably not realistic at the moment, but certainly one-to-many definitely is.
Yeah. So I know you guys have made great strides in pushing this out and being able to do it on almost like on a much larger scale in terms of being able to scan documents and those kind of things, which is obviously helps when you've got mass communication that's out there. But where do we go next from here? You guys have been in the sandbox with the FCA and you've been working with the FCA, but what's next in terms of rollout? What's next in terms of this whole idea around intelligibility rolling out across the industry? Where do you see it going in the next 5 years?
I think from our point of view, we've been developing and testing now for 3, 4, maybe even 5 years, and yet we're only really properly commercializing now. And we're in good
Mm,
conversation with lots of different banks, primarily at the moment in financial services, but across lots of other industries and verticals as well. So I think for us, our development really is looking at that presentation as well as the assessment and simplification that we've already got in place. So how do you present this information in a more engaging, potentially digital way and help firms to really make sure that the consumer is supported when they read this stuff? I think for regulation, the FCA have made it very clear this isn't the end point. The consumer duty is the start of what's coming. And so they've got the retained provisions of the Consumer Credit Act. It's a big mouthful. I'm glad I got that out. Okay, I'm struggling now. But that's looking at things like formatting and
yeah.
prominence and so on. I think that will lead them towards challenging this idea of a very flat sort of presentation, a Word
Mm,
document, PDF, whatever else. So I think that's really exciting, how that's going to shake up.
mm,
And I just think firms are going to find better ways of dealing with this. When they put their minds to it, big financial service organizations do have an innovative heart. They do want to
mm,
innovate. They've got some very clever people there. And I think this is a problem they're only beginning to crack. The
mm,
first year of consumer duty has been, can I get compliant? Can I get
mm,
the FCA off my back and do enough that I'm showing that I'm taking it seriously? I think the
mm,
real innovation comes next, where looking at changing the idea of the average consumer, as I said
mm,
previously, I think that's going to happen. I think a more digital approach is going to happen. I think this layered, rich layering, I think is going to come to
mm.
the fore. And ultimately, I think we're just going to get better able of understanding what intelligibility really is. And we've
Yeah.
only really looked at intelligibility in the round for the last 18 months, 2 years. It's been around for 50, and yet we've ignored it.
If you take a step back and you think about, and we were just chatting about for the last 20 years before we started the call, just think about where the industry's come from and where it is today in terms of all of the tools that are out there. It's hugely different. It just is massively
Mm,
different from where it used to be. It's very
mm.
interesting. I mean, and as you say, it feels like we're still on that journey to a certain extent.
Oh, absolutely. From AI perspective, at the moment we have some relatively clever chatbots and so on. So we've got these robo advisors. But if you could embed that in an onboarding process where you could question parts of what you're seeing and ask
Mm,
for explanations, and that AI, don't need someone on the end of the line, AI could provide a really simple explanation or
mm,
deliver material to you to help you almost have an advisor,
mm.
a helpful advisor on your side working for you as the consumer. I think that
Yeah,
would be a fantastic step forward. At the moment, we're a way away from that, but I don't think we're that far.
yeah,
I
yeah,
think that's an area we'd like to explore. I know Gilmore
yeah.
Centre are pretty keen to knock on our door and say, how does this work? So we'll see where that goes.
Well, thanks very much for making the time. It's fascinating. That's a very interesting vision of the future. So I think that would be pretty exciting.
Fingers
So thank
crossed we get there.
yeah, no, yeah. Thanks very much for making the time and give us an explanation. Really appreciate it.
Lovely. Lovely spending
Okay.
time with you, Chris.
Thanks.